Guys, it's Tuesday evening, and I've got around to watching the Arthur Abraham Gilberto Ramirez fight. I was looking forward to watching this fight. I hadn't seen too much of Ramirez before, and I'd had a lot of mixed reviews on his performance against Arthur Abraham. I had some individuals telling me that the form was worthless and that Arthur Abraham was so poor in the fight that the win over him meant very little. I had other individuals telling me that this Gilberto Ramirez is a serious elite boxer who's just announced himself on the world stage. I had a lot of people comparing him to Callum Smith. And it seems that he is going to be a new man to look out for in the 168-pound division. So I've watched the fight, and I've got a few thoughts that I wanted to put down. Firstly, the size of him. This is a very big guy. This is a guy who is, I don't know how tall he is, but let's put it this way, he was towering over Arthur Abraham. I'm guessing he's 6'3", 6'4". He's also well built. He's not, don't get me wrong, he's obviously a very rangy, lengthy individual, but he looks strong at the weight. He looks like a physical specimen. I don't know if he's cutting a lot of weight to get down to 168, but he is a very big super middleweight, and I can see where the Callum Smith comparisons come in terms of aesthetic, because these two must be the biggest guys at 168 pounds. I mean, he looked massive compared to Arthur Abraham in there. The fight, you guys probably know by now, I'm late to the party, was scored as a landslide to Gilberto Ramirez. Ramirez won every single round, and what was, for me, interesting was how I still haven't quite made up my mind as to whether Arthur Abraham was completely ineffective against Ramirez or whether Ramirez was dominant over Arthur Abraham. And Ramirez was taking away Arthur Abraham's game. I haven't quite made a decision on that yet. But Arthur Abraham was not in this fight at all. Ramirez was completely dominant, and it was a good performance. Looking back at this fight, you have to question. I mean, it's actually put doubts in my mind over how good Arthur Abraham was. I like to think of Arthur Abraham as this superbly considered veteran who found ways of outsmarting challengers and outwitting and stealing rounds and perfecting his style. But based on this performance, it's hard to think that a guy like Martin Murray couldn't get the better of him. But let's talk about Gilberto Ramirez first. So, whilst physically he fights like Callum Smith, I actually don't see him as a stylist. Sorry, whilst physically he appears like Callum Smith in terms of his size and his build, I don't necessarily see him as a stylistic comparator to Callum Smith. This Gilberto Ramirez, to my eye, appears to have an elite set of legs in terms of lateral movement. This guy moves around the ring really well. At times, and I'm not saying he's a direct comparator, but at times I thought his movement was reminiscent of Chris Algieri fighting Ruslan Provodnikov. He was really using the length of the ring. He was moving side to side. He was able to take a step back, and he dominated the range in this fight completely. He dominated the range in this fight completely. I have never seen Arthur Abraham as inaccurate. Well, maybe when he fought Andre Ward, I guess. But, he made Arthur Abraham look wildly inaccurate. We saw Arthur Abraham chasing him around like a ghost. We saw Arthur Abraham throwing wild punches that were falling short. And I don't know if it was Ramirez fighting out of a southpaw stance, which could have confused matters. Sometimes that makes things very difficult when you're trying to judge your range. Or if it was just the size of him, but Arthur Abraham was, throwing a big punch, and Ramirez just wasn't there to be hit. Whether that's because Ramirez is so big at the weight he can just be out of range and still hit Abraham. I think it's a combination of the three. I think it's a combination of, one, the southpaw stance, two, the size of him, which allows him to fight from real range, and three, the movement. He's quick on his feet. He can take a quick step back and move from side to side so quickly that he's hard to hit. And defensively, he's got some. I'm not going to say he's like Floyd Mayweather defensively. Defensively, he's got some real skills. I saw numerous occasions in the fight where he anticipated, his reflexes were on point, he anticipated an Arthur Abraham power punch. Yes, he bent at the waist and ducked under it, and then he'd kind of duck under it, pivot to the side and escape. And, for a guy as big as he is, to be as elusive at times with his movement was really impressive. There were elements of his movement defensively that reminded me of Chris Algieri, that reminded me of Tyson Fury almost, I'm talking about big, rangy, lanky guys for their weights, but guys who are still light on their feet, guys who can still dance a bit. I was impressed. I was really impressed. For me, this guy isn't like Callum Smith at all. He's a lot more elastic. His game is a lot more fluid. He's not rigid. He's not robotic. I'm not going to go at Callum Smith here. I'm saying when Ramirez throws punches, there is a real flow to his combinations, and he's got real punch variety as well. Clearly he's a big guy. He's a tall guy. You'd like to see him have a good jab, and he's got a jab. His jab isn't world class. There's more to come from the jab. He could use his jab better. He could maybe jab to the body a bit better. But he's interesting because whilst he's got this tall style, whilst he's got this tall physique that you typically associate with a straight 1-2, his inclination is actually to get involved in a scrap, And I've seen criticism of him in the past that he's a bit wild, but maybe he was less wild in this fight because it was a step up in class. But he's got some good punches. He's got some good hand speed and combinations. One thing that I like in fighters is when they change levels with their combinations. And I know that sounds like a very basic thing, but you can actually get to a reasonably high level in boxing without people seeing changing levels. And this guy, he was working Arthur Abraham to up high, because how Arthur Abraham always has that tight, stiff guard. So he's working him up high, and he'd swap and go low to the body. And often he was carving a gap under Abraham's guard by keeping his guard high and then going to the body. And Arthur Abraham's vulnerable to that, and he exposed it. Then he'd come up again high with a wide hook, I liked what I saw in this. I liked what I saw in this at all. And whilst Ramirez didn't exactly, he wasn't like looking like he was going to knock Abraham out, his punches appear to be heavy to my eye. He looks like he's got snap in him. He looked like he could hurt a guy, and this guy's a threat. This guy is a threat. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying he's a James DeGale level or he's an Andre Ward level, but this guy is certainly in the mix of a George Groves, a Callum Smith, a Badu Jack, a Felix Sturm, a Fedor Chudinov, a Martin Murray. He's certainly that level, if not the top end of that level, with upside to get higher. Arthur Abraham is very, very good at what he does. The criticisms of Abraham would be he can be outworked in terms of output. His guard is too rigid, and maybe doesn't protect his body. Maybe he's a bit one-dimensional. And this guy came up with a real good game plan, and his output was exceptional. Whenever Abraham had those spurts where Abraham was trying to have a powerful 30 seconds and trying to land his swarms of note like he does, this guy was firing straight back. He wouldn't let Abraham get into the fight. He'd start the round strong, scoring points, picking shots, and then whenever Abraham looked to establish himself and come on late in the rounds, like we've seen him do time and time again, this guy was having none of it. He'd create the space, create the range, pivot away, and then he'd come back with a hurtful 3 or 4 punch combination. And I really liked his engine in this fight as well. For a guy as big as he is, to move like he moved, to throw combinations, to have high punch output, to outwork his opponent. I like that. I like that. He was frustrating Arthur Abraham. He was beating him from range. He was beating him with combinations. He was outmaneuvering him. He was making him miss. He was making him chase him. There was a lot to like here. This was a real good performance for me. A real good performance. Arthur Abraham's beatable at an elite level, but Abraham finds a way of outsmarting and outworking the European and Commonwealth level fighters. You know, the guys like Paul Smith, the guys like Martin Murray, the guys who are just sort of world level, they don't tend to get victories over Arthur Abraham. And this guy not only scored a victory over him, but scored a victory over him in dominant fashion. You know, for me, at this stage, this guy is possibly a more exciting prospect than Callum Smith. And I use the word prospect in a certain context. I mean, to be fair to him, he's just won a world title. But we're in the age of boxing where guys win a world title and are still prospects. And, you know, this guy, he maybe doesn't have the, you know, maybe he's a bit wilder than Callum Smith. Maybe he doesn't have the single punch power of a Callum Smith. But he's well-rounded. Let me tell you, this guy, it was one of the things I look for in world-level boxers, is how well-rounded they are, how complete they are. I'm looking at a guy who's a monster for the division he's in, who can move on his back foot, who's got the punch output to dominate the action, who can punch to the body, who's got a huge variety of combinations in his arsenal. I'm looking at a guy who's that big but can bend on at the waist and, you know, come in and duck under punches. I'm looking at a guy who can out jab you and out box you from the outside, but whose inclination is to have a bit of a fight in the pocket. You know, I'm liking what I'm seeing here. I'm liking what I'm seeing, and I think Gilberto Ramirez is a really one to watch and an interesting fighter, a real interesting fighter. He's clearly taken his form to a new level with this fight. From what I'd seen of him in the past, which was minimal, I admit, I didn't get the impression we were looking at a world beater here. I didn't get an impression we were looking at a guy as complete and as well schooled. And I also think he needs to be given credit for his tactics in this fight. You know, he fought a tactically very good fight here. You know, he did the obvious things, the body attack, the high output, but then he also took it to a next level with his defensive game and how he was making Arthur Abraham chase him. You know, Arthur Abraham is a long-time world champion. He was frustrated, he was out of ideas, he was chasing someone he couldn't catch, and he was picked off and beaten up. I was very impressed. Let me know your thoughts if you've seen the fight. Is this guy a threat? How does Ramirez stack up with our UK super middles? Gale, Murray, Groves, Callum Smith, Rocky Fielding. Do you rate him? You know, as is always the way when somebody gets a victory of this nature, people will say Arthur Abraham's a shot fighter, Vladimir Klitschko's a shot fighter, Timothy Bradley's a shot fighter. You know, we hear it time and time again. But let's not forget, Arthur Abraham is a very tough man to beat. And if you look at his resume, the fighters who beat Arthur Abraham tend to be very good fighters. Credit to Ramirez. I'll certainly be tuning in next time he fights. If you've enjoyed this, do hit the thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. I'm going to try and watch the Valdez versus Gradovic fight next, and I'll certainly do a follow-up video on that. Many thanks for watching.